Beautiful. Thank you very much. I think about, the history of my own family and communities, and if I think back generationally, how they were impacted time and time again by the forces that you've talked about, and still are. But throughout all of that, they didn't change who they were, their DNA, their aspirations, and the way they interacted with their lands and their own economies. So that leads me to my next question, kind of thinking about the landscape today. What is the current relationship between Indigenous economy and the public sector, if we think federally, provincially, locally?
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. I think that I like that idea of happen to us versus designed by us. So there's 150 plus years of the experience of what has happened to us as Indigenous people to center our relationship, our leadership of who we are, to shift towards designed by us. I think that's this new emerging space, and that frames reconciliation, but it also supports our learning, elevating our conversations, elevating the content of addressing the assumptions of what taking a seat at the economic table means and the structures of exclusion over time. I think it means addressing the assumptions of how we see the Indigenous population. So many times our reality is expressed through the socioeconomic gap. So we have the highest suicide, the lowest education, the highest number in prison, whatever those numbers are. The perception of that is described as largely on the cost side of the equation. So the concept of Indigenomics is really, we need to be seen as the space for economic freedom, to be able to operate and advance our well-being and structures of nation building and self-determination in tangible ways. And I think for the public sector to engage in self-determination, to engage in the structures of Indigenous-led design, that's really the response to now. And that expresses itself within elevating our conversations, elevating our leadership in the questions that we ask, elevating the quality of questions and content in the sense of testing the evolution of our own knowledge. So even understanding and building that kind of toolbox of understanding. So whether that's, I've never understood the Royal Proclamation, or how is Indigenous rights different than human rights? Why is there a distinction? Really taking the time to ask and understand where the development of your own understanding is.
Excellent. And I think sort of coming to terms with or creating an equal understanding of what these pieces of legislation mean for all of us. So you're out in the field, essentially. Can you tell us what Indigenous nations are doing to advance their economies?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's volumes and volumes of unnecessary work that reflects this constant narrative of challenges and barriers to Indigenous economic development. I think my singular point would be Indigenous nations are undoing those barriers and challenges. They're not looking at the wall saying, we can't get over this. I think it's building partnerships, bringing partnerships in with capacity, creating networks of access to capital in new and innovative ways, and utilizing that to be able to build the structures of a circular economy. So it's important to understand that Indigenous business, whether it's a singular entrepreneur, that singular entrepreneur is responding to build a different reality than the experience of poverty or the experience of the socioeconomic gap. If we look at the First Nations Economic Development Corporation or a community series of businesses, the intention of that, while revenue is essential, the intention is also deeply connected to continuation of identity, continuation of ways of being, continuation of creating pathways to self-determination, nation building, and well-being. So whether that's revenue that supports continuation of knowledge through elders or through language, or I think that's understanding how Indigenous business is distinct from a mainstream perspective of business, that it's not just revenue for revenue, that is literally the creation of the social economy reinforced through Indigenous identity.
So it's almost like you have the economy tied to a social economy, a spiritual economy, a physical economy. They're all interconnected. So could you tell me a little bit about the circular point you made?
I think that what we're seeing in this legal tension, let's take the last example, probably the most recent here in BC with the Blueberry River First Nation win. It's a game changer. It changes everything. Either everybody has to take a seat at the table and move over. When you look at that dynamic, really to understand that the embedded structure of continuity. So if we look at the clauses within the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the concept that we have the right to continue, we have the right to continue our ways of being, those rights are so distinct because they're integral to identity, to worldviews, to ways of being. So that interplay between the right to continue as people, if we look to that Blueberry River example, where there was a cumulative effects that established no turning back, that right to continue is impacted by the pace of business and the scale in terms of impact. That's something to consider, is the consistent experience of seeing Indigenous peoples on the impact or the cost side of the equation versus the generative, constructive reality of economic development as a progressive approach to development and to design. So I think that circular nature really supports that. In what ways does business reflect who we are? In what ways can our business model increase our ability to take care of place? So Indigenous peoples inherently understand responsibility as deeply spiritual, connected to place and connected to identity fluidly. And it's that circular embedded responsibility that I think offers different pathways of the expression of business and Indigenous business models.